Soyan was eating cold ramen at 2 a.m. when the alien ship fell out of the sky. She heard it before she saw it. A sound like the atmosphere itself tearing along a seam, followed by something between a boom and a groan that rattled the single window of her monitoring station. She set down her chopsticks. Outside, across the dark Mongolian steppe, a streak of orange-white light carved the sky open and hit the earth somewhere past the ridge, maybe 3 kilometers out. She stared at it for a full 4 seconds. Then she grabbed her coat, her med kit, her field radio, and the emergency flare gun she had never once used in 2 years of working for the UN First Contact Preparedness Division, a department so chronically underfunded that her monitoring station was a converted sheep pen, and she ran. The walk-run across the steppe in late October was miserable. The wind came sideways off the high plain and smelled like frozen grass, and something else now, something chemical and faintly sweet, like burnt copper and vanilla mixed together. That smell got stronger as she crested the ridge. Below her, a crater had appeared in the earth, shallow but wide, and in the center of it sat what she could only describe as a seed pod the size of a city bus. It was dark except for a pulsing amber light along the seams, and it ticked loudly as it cooled, metal contracting in the cold. Soyan slid down the ridge on her boots and stopped at the crater's edge. The field radio crackled in her hand. She tried to call it in. The signal came back scrambled. Whatever radiation this thing was emitting had turned her radio into static. She was alone. She was alone with an alien spacecraft on a freezing Mongolian steppe, and her ramen was getting cold back at the station. The seam on the pod split. Steam rushed out. Then a hand appeared, 5-fingered, which surprised her, gripping the edge of the opening. The hand was wrong in small ways. The skin was the color of deep water, almost teal, and each knuckle had a faint ridge of something that looked like cartilage raised under the surface. The fingers were too long by one joint, but it was still recognizably a hand, and it was shaking. He fell out of the pod rather than stepped. He hit the disturbed soil of the crater on his hands and knees, and he made a sound that Soyan's brain processed instantly and without translation as pain. He was tall. She'd figure out later that he was nearly 2 meters, with a lean build wrapped in something that had once been armor and was now mostly wreckage. Pieces of it were missing. Where it was missing, she could see that the wound beneath was seeping something darker than blood, more like oil, catching the amber light from the pod. He looked up. His eyes were the problem. They were large, structured differently, with a pale luminescent quality to the iris that made him look like he was lit from inside. They fixed on her with an expression she couldn't name. Then he said something in a language that sounded like wine through river reeds, syllables that rose and fell melodically, and he held up one hand in what she recognized with absolute certainty as a gesture meaning, please wait or stop. She had stopped already. Okay, she said, because she had to say something. Okay, you're okay. Are you okay? You probably don't speak Korean. She switched to English. Can you understand me? He stared at her. His breath came in visible clouds in the October air. Then he said, very slowly and with tremendous effort, the word, cold. She blinked. Then she took off her coat and walked down into the crater. His name took her 3 days to learn to pronounce properly. It was something like cave, with the last sound requiring a subtle vibration at the back of the throat that Soyan practiced until her voice was raw. He watched her attempts with an expression she gradually identified as the alien equivalent of trying not to laugh. He was polite about it. Mostly. His full name and title. Once he figured out how to convey it through the combination of his emergency translation device, a flat disk that pressed against his throat and converted meaning, imperfectly, and Soyan's limited patience, was something like Prince Kavaro of the 3rd Stellar House of the Vacon Dominion. She wrote it down. She looked at it. She wrote it in her field journal as Prince K, 3rd House, Vacon, and closed the book. The Vacon had been watching Earth for about 80 years, apparently. They'd been negotiating, at a level far above Soyan's pay grade, for a formal introduction between their civilization and humanities for the last 12. The prince's arrival was supposed to be that introduction. It was supposed to be ceremonial. There had been plans. A landing strip in Geneva, a formal reception, diplomats in suits. Instead, he'd been hit by debris from his own escort vessel, destroyed by a faction within his own government that didn't want peace, and had ejected in a single-person emergency pod and fallen on top of Soyen's step in the middle of the night. "There are people who want to kill you," she confirmed, on day 2, sitting across from him in her sheep pen station while he attempted to drink instant coffee and winced. "Yes," the translation disc said, his mouth moving around sounds that emerged as English through the device. "There are people who want to kill me, and they destroyed your escort ships. 2 of them. Yes." She turned her own coffee cup around in her hands. "So the peace mission is compromised." "Yes. And you don't know where your allies are." "The signal." He paused, recalibrated, the disc buzzing faintly against his throat. "My allies will be searching, but the debris from my vessels may have confused the search. They may think I died in the explosion." Soyeon looked at him. He was wrapped in her spare blanket, which was patterned with cartoon cats, and pieces of his destroyed armor were stacked neatly in the corner because he'd asked, politely, urgently, to keep them. His wounds were still seeping that dark, oily fluid, which she'd come to understand was his equivalent of blood, slightly more viscous than hers, with clotting properties that were genuinely faster. He was healing. Slower than he'd like, probably, but he was healing. "Can you contact them?" she asked. "Your allies?" "With equipment I don't have." "What would you need?" He looked at her in a way she couldn't fully decode yet. "That would take longer. You would help with this?" "My entire job," she said, "is literally to make first contact and assist. I'm the only person at this station. My radio is still fried. I have one working truck, and the nearest town is 40 kilometers away. But yes, that's my job." A pause. "I thought," the disc translated, "your job was to listen and report." "Well, right now there's nothing to report to, so I'm improvising." He made a sound, not a word, just a sound, that the disc didn't translate. But the expression on his face looked, she thought, like the first tiny piece of tension going out of his shoulders. His name for her was something the disc translated roughly as bright small specific, which he eventually admitted was because of how she moved. Quick, precise, taking up less space than her energy suggested she should. She told him her name was Soyeon, and he tried to say it. He got the first syllable right, and then added a vowel sound at the end that didn't exist in Korean. She let him keep it. It sounded strange and specific in his voice, like her name in a dialect she'd never heard before. He was not what she'd expected. She'd spent 2 years training for first contact, xenolinguistics, xenobiology basics, conflict resolution, cultural sensitivity across 8 different hypothetical alien frameworks. The training had managed to be both exhaustive and completely useless. None of it covered what to do when an alien prince sat in your converted sheep pen and, upon discovering what a ceramic mug was, turned it over and over in his long-jointed hands with an expression of genuine, unguarded delight. "Use shape clay," he said, "and fire it, and drink from it. We've been doing that for thousands of years." He turned the mug over again. The cartoon cats stared up from it. "This," the disc said, and it buzzed in a way that suggested he was searching for the right concept. There's a word in Vacon, something like beautiful because it's old and simple. We'd probably say humble," she said, "or honest." He considered that. Then he nodded, slowly, and set the mug down with care. She didn't feel anything specific about that moment. She told herself she didn't feel anything specific about that moment. She picked up her field journal and wrote equipment inventory. Check radio again. Contact UN relay station by truck if radio remains non-functional. She did not write anything about alien princes and ceramic mugs. By day 4, the wound on his side had closed enough that he could move properly, and his personality emerged from behind the careful diplomatic restraint he'd been maintaining. He was, it turned out, opinionated. He had thoughts about everything. About the quality of her instant coffee, poor, but interesting. About the steppe, vast in a way that reminded him of the southern reaches of the second Vacon continent. About Earth radio transmissions they'd been monitoring. He had listened, apparently, to decades of human music and had strong opinions about the 1990s, specifically. The era of the sound with much feeling and distorted resonance. Rock and grunge. There was a group, he said carefully. A human group. For individuals. They sang about, the disc buzzed, a yellow boat. A yellow submarine, she said. That's the Beatles. They're from the 60s. Earlier. He looked mildly frustrated. The eras are difficult to organize. You've been listening to our music for 40 years, and you mixed up the decades. We were also monitoring political transmissions and scientific signals, and a pause. His chin lifted slightly, which she'd learned was defensive. The music was not the primary mission. Uh-huh. He looked at her sidelong. He said, without the disc, in his own language, the river-reed sound of it. Something quiet, and then the disc caught up. You don't treat me as a prince. She thought about that. Would you prefer I did? Another pause. Longer. No, he said finally. I would not prefer that. She fixed the truck's fuel line on day 5 with wires she found in a supply box, and the kind of mechanical intuition born from 2 years of maintaining equipment alone in a remote station. Cave watched her from a careful distance, and when she finally got the engine to turn over, he made that untranslated sound again, the one the disc didn't catch, and she looked up to find him watching her with an expression that had too many layers for her to read quickly. What? She said. In the Dominion, he said, there are engineers. Skilled people. They spend years learning to interface with our vessels. And you fixed a combustion vehicle with found materials in. How long? 40 minutes, maybe. He was quiet for a moment. Your species is very. The disc doesn't have the word I want. He made the vacant sound, and then the disc offered. Stubborn? Persistent? Inventive? Probably all 3, she said, wiping her hands on a rag. He smiled. She saw it. It was different from a human smile. The mouth didn't quite curve the same way, and the luminescence in his eyes shifted slightly, brightened, but it was a smile in every way that mattered, and it landed on her like a weight she wasn't prepared for. She turned back to the truck engine. We should get to the relay station tomorrow, she said, to the engine. She drove the 40 kilometers to the nearest relay point on day 6. Cave sat in the passenger seat wrapped in her spare coat, which fit him badly. The shoulders were wrong, the sleeves too short, and watched the step go by with his large luminescent eyes catching the low autumn light. He didn't talk for the first hour. She didn't push. Eventually he said, I don't know if my homeworld still stands. The truck bumped over a rut. Soyeon adjusted her grip on the wheel. The faction that destroyed your ships, she said. They've been growing for years. They don't believe peace with other species is compatible with vacant sovereignty. He said the word sovereignty with a heaviness that suggested it was a weight he'd been carrying a long time. My father believed otherwise. The peace mission was his design. I was sent as his representative. His argument. An argument in a person. Yes. She thought about that. About what it was to be sent somewhere as proof of something. She'd taken the assignment at the remote station partly because she'd wanted to be alone, and partly because nobody else had wanted it, and partly because she'd needed to be somewhere that felt like the edge of things, where the work was simple and clear. She understood, in some way, the thing he was describing, being defined by what you represent, not who you are. Your father sounds like he believed in something, she said. He does. He's not dead. A pause. I don't know if he's dead. She reached the relay station just before noon. It was a small concrete structure, crewed by a Mongolian meteorological team who were deeply confused to receive her, and then were considerably more confused by Cave, who stood outside and waited with diplomatic restraint while the team stared at him through the window. She got a signal out through the relay station's long-range equipment. Not to the UN directly. The fried state of the Vacun pod had created an interference bubble that extended further than she'd realized, but to a research vessel in orbit whose name she didn't recognize, responding in both English and Vacun phonemes. Cave's face changed when he heard the voice through the speaker. He said something quickly, something the disc caught as, I'm alive. I'm here. The voice on the other end said something back. His entire body went through a series of changes she couldn't fully track. Relief, first, physical and visible, the tension going out of his spine, and then something complicated crossed his face, and he said a sentence that the disc translated with a lag. How many of the escort crew? Silence on the line. Then, not many. She watched him absorb that. He stood very still. Outside, the steppe was golden in the midday light, wind moving through the grass, and he stood in the doorway of the relay station looking at the horizon with his eyes gone dark. Not literally, but in the way that eyes go dark when someone is holding something enormous very quietly inside themselves. She went and stood next to him. She didn't say anything. After a moment, without looking at her, He pressed the back of his hand briefly against the back of her hand. It was a small gesture. She didn't know if it was a Vacun gesture or something he'd invented in the moment. She didn't ask. She let it happen. The extraction team arrived on day 8. 2 Vacun vessels, smaller and faster than the ceremonial ships would have been, landed on the plain near the monitoring station. The crew were a type of soldier. The disc called them something like shield bearers, and they moved with the efficiency of people who expected things to go wrong and had planned for most of them. They swept the site. They checked Kava's injuries. They spoke to him in rapid Vacun that the disc rendered in fragments. The lead shield bearer, a shorter, broader figure whose skin had a blue-gray cast, addressed Soyan directly, and the disc managed. You provided safety for the prince. He fell on my step, she said. I didn't have a lot of choices. The shield bearer looked at her for a moment. You had the choice to report and wait for authorities. Radio was broken. A pause. It could have been repaired. 40 minutes, yes. By which point he might have died from his wounds if I hadn't addressed them first. Another pause. Longer. The shield bearer said something to Cave in Vacun. Cave replied. She caught her own name, her Vacun accented name, the extra vowel at the end, in his sentence. She spent that night, her last night, presumably, packing up the monitoring station. It would have to be decommissioned now, the location compromised by the Vacun pod landing. All of it. 2 years of her life, sheep pen and broken radios and cold ramen and the field journals lined up on the shelf. She packed methodically. She was good at it. She'd moved often enough. Cave came to the doorway of the station. You're not sleeping, he said. I pack when I'm restless. She folded a thermal shirt. Old habit. He came in and sat on the floor. Not in a chair, just on the floor, cross-legged, in what she'd realized was his default resting position, comfortable and unbothered by the fact that it was the floor. He watched her pack. The political situation at home is not resolved, he said, after a while. The faction that attacked my ships, they're not gone. I'm going back to the disc is going to say burning throne, and that's roughly accurate. She stopped folding. And you know this? Yes. And you're going anyway? Yes. It's my father's work. It's the work. He paused. I would rather it not be. But I don't have the option to prefer otherwise. She sat down on the floor across from him, the folded shirt in her lap. That's a hard thing to be clear-eyed about. I've had time to be clear-eyed. The 8 days have been, he stopped. The disc buzzed, searching. The 8 days have been the most non-ceremonial of my life. She almost laughed. Is that good or bad? Good, he said, very simply and immediately. And that simplicity was the issue, because simple things from him had started landing different. Than she'd expected, and she was running out of months to get used to it in. She looked at the shirt in her lap. I should say something professional, she said. About the mission. About the peace process. You should. I'm not going to, though. I know, he said. I can tell. She looked up. His eyes were doing that thing, the brightness shifting, the luminescence adjusting, and she thought she was starting, finally, to read it, like learning a language one word at a time. That particular quality of brightness meant something she didn't have a word for yet. She thought it might be the same thing she was feeling, which was also something she didn't have a word for. If the peace mission succeeds, she said. When, he said. When? Would you, she stopped. Would Vacun people be able to come to Earth? That's the hope. Exchanges. Eventually. And you specifically? He was quiet for a moment. I would want to, he said. I would want to very much. A pause. Is that? Yes, she said. That's what I was asking. He reached out and touched her hand again. Not the back of hand gesture this time. He wrapped his 2 long fingers around her hand properly and held it. And she felt the strange, slightly higher warmth of his temperature and the texture of the raised cartilage ridges at his knuckles, and she thought, quite clearly, I am in significant trouble, and it is too late to do anything about it. She let him hold her hand. The morning the ships left was gray and windy, the steppe washed pale and enormous under a low sky. The UN teams had arrived overnight. For vehicles, 12 people, several of whom were higher ranked than anyone Soyan had ever personally worked with. And the debrief had been rapid and overwhelming and slightly surreal. She'd given her field journals over. She'd answered questions. She'd sat in the back of a UN vehicle wrapped in an emergency blanket someone had handed her and eaten a protein bar and felt the strange depletion of high S. Takes events ending. Cave was in formal attire now. The shield bearers had brought it. It was different from his destroyed armor, ceremonial, structured differently, a deep red-black color that moved in the light in a way that suggested material she couldn't identify. He looked like what he was. It was strange to see, after 8 days of cartoon cat mugs and cold step mornings. He found her at the edge of the staging area. "The UN diplomat is very upset with me," she said, before he could speak. "Apparently, I should not have done most of what I did. There are protocols. Were the protocols available to you?" "I had a pamphlet." "Then I don't think the protocols were actually available." "That's what I said." She looked up at him. He was very tall in the ceremonial attire, very much a prince. And also he'd told her he liked the Beatles' 60s output specifically for the way the harmonies worked, and he'd tried to eat 2 different brands of instant ramen for comparison purposes. He preferred the spicier one, and she had watched him learn to use a can opener with the complete focus of someone solving an important intellectual problem. She held both of these things in her mind at the same time. "I'll make the report," she said. "Accurately. About the peace mission. About the faction and the attack and the status of your escort crew." Her throat was steady. She was good at steady. "It'll all be in the record." "I know." He looked at her. The luminescence in his eyes was doing the thing. "Theon." He said it right this time. Both syllables, correct, no extra vowel. She didn't say anything. "The peace mission's next phase will proceed through diplomatic channels," he said. "There will be Vacon representatives on Earth. In probably 6 of your months. If it holds. If we can hold it. That's a big if. It is. I know what I'm going back to. But it's the work." He paused. "There's something I'd like to ask you." "Okay. If the mission holds. If the diploma. Tick exchange proceeds. Would you?" He stopped. The disc buzzed. He switched to English directly, without it. "Would you be the representative?" "The human representative. For the exchange." She blinked. "That's not my call. That's about 12 levels above my." "I've already spoken to your diplomatic team," he said. "Your UN. I've made a formal request." A pause. "It's your call whether to accept." She stared at him. "You requested me specifically." "Yes." "By name." "By name." He was doing something with his expression that might have been the alien equivalent of deliberately not looking smug, which was a type of expression she was starting to recognize. "Cave." "Yes." That's a very formal way to ask something that might be a personal question. The brightness shifted in his eyes. Not smug, she decided. Not quite. Something warmer than that, with an edge of uncertainty that reminded her he was also doing something new here, also learning the shape of this in real time. "I wasn't sure of the correct protocol," he said. "For asking a human to," the disc searched, buzzed. "For asking a human to come toward me, when I can't come toward them yet." Soyan was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the steppe. Somewhere behind her, the UN vehicles were running, and the Vacon shield bearers were completing their final checks, and the whole enormous mechanism of first contact was clicking forward into history. 6 months, she said. Approximately. I'll need to file a lot of paperwork. Probably yes. And there are actual protocols, which I will read this time. I think that would be wise. And when you say diplomatic exchange, you mean? I mean exactly what you're hoping I mean, he said, quiet and direct, and she stopped asking. She nodded once. That was all she said. He looked at her for a moment, the luminescence steady and bright, that quality she'd finally found a name for, the same word for it in any language. Wanting, patient, real, and then he did some. Nothing she hadn't seen him do before. He pressed both of his palms briefly together and then extended them toward her, flat. A gesture the disc didn't translate, and he didn't explain, and she understood it anyway the way you understand some things, in the body before the brain catches up. She pressed her palms together and extended them back. She probably did it wrong. She didn't have the right number of knuckle ridges and her hands were half the size of his, and the gesture had probably been imprecise. He didn't correct her. He went to his ship. She watched it lift, both of them, the smaller Vacon vessels, rising in a way that was too smooth for the physics she was used to, cutting up through the gray sky and disappearing in seconds. The sound they left behind was nothing. No boom, no rumble, just the wind and the grass moving in it, and the wide, cold quiet of the Mongolian steppe. She stood there for a while. Then she went and found the UN diplomat who was upset with her, a tired-looking Korean man named Director Huang, who had a thermos of actual coffee, and was very willing to share, and she sat down across from him and began the debrief properly. Walk me through it from the beginning, Huang said. I was eating ramen, Soyan said. At about 2 a.m. He wrote that down. He looked up, and then the sky opened up, she said. And everything changed, and honestly the protocol pamphlet was not sufficient, and I'll be submitting a very detailed report about that. He looked at her for a moment. Then he poured more coffee into her cup. I think, he said, slowly, you probably handled it correctly. I made a lot of it up. That, said Director Huang, is generally how first contact goes. She laughed. It came out a little ragged, a little loose, the kind of laugh that happens when you've been holding a lot of things carefully for 8 days. Huang looked mildly startled. She didn't explain it. She kept the mug, the cartoon cat mug that Cave had too, Renette over in his hands, and called beautiful because it was old and simple. It was dented on the rim from 2 years of field use, and the cartoon cats had started to fade from washing. She wrapped it in a thermal shirt and put it in the bottom of her duffel bag. 6 months, approximately. She had a lot of paperwork to file. She had protocols to read. She had, as it turned out, a new job, or the possibility of one, pending approximately 1,000 approvals from approximately 1,000 people more senior than her, all of whom were currently scrambling because the prince of an alien civilization had filed a formal diplomatic request naming a specific human by name, and there were forms for that, apparently, deep in the UN First Contact framework, forms that had never been used, forms that someone had written hopefully years ago and filed. Under contingency, she was going to need to fill out every single one of them. She also had, right now, a cold morning on the step and a protein bar and Director Huang's good coffee. She drank it. She thought about River Reed's syllables and luminescent eyes and the particular warmth of 2 long fingers and an alien prince who had learned to say her name correctly on the last day and used it like punctuation. She thought about burning thrones and the work that has to be done regardless. She thought about 6 months, approximately, and how strange it was that approximately felt like enough. The wind moved across the steppe. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, gray softening toward the particular thin gold of high-altitude dawn, the kind of light that made even frozen grass look like something worth keeping. Somewhere in orbit, in the dark above that light, 2 small fast ships were burning toward a home that was on fire and a peace that hadn't broken yet, and a prince who was going to have to hold something enormous very carefully for a long time. She understood that. She thought she could work with that. She finished her coffee. She picked up her duffel bag. She found the official UN diplomatic liaison who needed her to sign 14 things, and she signed all 14 things and asked for a copy of the protocol framework, the entire thing, all volumes, please, and she read the first 3 sections in the back of the vehicle on the way to the nearest airfield, with the step rolling past outside the window and the mug wrapped safe in her bag and the paperwork already beginning.